Hi, hello everybody. Good morning. Welcome to a new week of virtual learning. What we're going to talk about today is the last information in not key issue in chapter 12 for our final unit that we're going to be doing. Today we're going to just be wrapping up key issue 4, which is looking at early settlements and the different styles of settlements before we get to what today's overall settlements look like, which is going to be cities in most cases. So we're going to talk a little bit through that, going from rural all the way up to, again, what will be traditionally a city, the largest settlements that exist out there. There'll be a little bit at the end where you guys can have a chance to do some quick reviewing on your own to see what has sunk in and what hasn't. And then I've got work to be completed for you. So we're going to start by talking about rural settlements. So when we're talking about this idea of distribution of settlements and what do they look like, rural are going to be presented in two different forms. The first are referred to as clustered. These are all pretty straightforward is how I would describe this particular part of the key issue. Clustered rural settlement is an agricultural based community, meaning that the base of their economy, which was talked about at the end of not yesterday's, the end of last PowerPoint, looking at the idea of economic base. When we see a rural settlement like this, the agriculture is going to be the foundation, and then the services are going to be drawn to that settlement to provide for those people who are, again, with a basic economy as they have. Going to be exporting all of their goods elsewhere. In a clustered rural settlement, a number of families are going to live in close proximity to each other, so they're going to be really close together. And then the fields that are going to support that agricultural based economy overall are going to be surrounding on the outside. And there's collections of houses and farms and buildings. Typically, you're going to see that all of these settlements, everything is kind of right on top of each other. The homes, the barns, tool sheds, consumer services, religious structures, schools, shops, they're all going to be kind of squished together. Again, if we are going to make any kind of specific early days of Slinger, Wisconsin, definitely would be considered a rural settlement. That is for sure. We were an agricultural based economy, at least for a while. Then there's a different type of rural settlement, which is called dispersed. Basically, what a dispersed settlement is just the opposite of a clustered settlement. We're going to see in these types, these are more of the unincorporated kind of spaces that you've encountered around and throughout Wisconsin, I'm sure. And typically in the North America, rural landscape, these are characterized by farmers living on individual farms really far away from each other, especially going into the more central parts of our country. You're going to see a lot of that. Again, big commercial farms, which keep people apart, basically. And there isn't a center of that kind of a settlement. They usually have to go and seek out their consumer services at a settlement that's close by. This is an interesting thing that changes the landscape of the United States. But the United States is not the only place where there are rural settlements, and it's an interesting thing to compare it to a place like the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom did an active change, had an active role to play in how their settlements are going to look and where the importance is going to lie in the, again, 18th century or so through the introduction of the enclosure movement. This enclosure movement was the process of taking a bunch of small individual land holdings, farms, and putting them into big ones, which changed the whole rural landscape of the UK at that time. It did, of course, increase agricultural efficiency because they didn't have to go from field to field to field quite as much, but it totally destroyed village life. This was coupled or exacerbated by the Industrial Revolution starting, so people were naturally leaving these rural settlements and going towards cities. But it does have an impact to this day on the way that the countryside of the UK looks in comparison to the United States, where we have this, again, differing types depending on where we're at and when the settlements were formed. So just some examples, just looking at this process. So we've got ourselves a clustered, obviously with all these buildings close together, homes, so on and so forth, and then a dispersed where you have this one singular farm totally surrounded by their land. So, again, when we're looking at this process, we're trying to understand what these settlements look like and kind of how is it that consumer services came to be clustered the way that they are, to be concentrated the way that they are. So, in early consumer services, there weren't a lot because they didn't need to. You have to recognize that early on in this process, everyone was in agriculture. That was just how it went until things changed on a large scale. It's just not something that happened. Most people worked in farming, as we have seen and we've talked about before. So early consumer services were pretty specialized. Again, places to bury the dead, religious leaders, they usually would be the ones in charge of providing that service. Again, stationed at the burial sites to perform the service. Again, they would likely encourage the building of more permanent structures, aka thinking of a church or some other kind of building to be able to do so. Again, other sort of consumer services that were again available would be connected to manufacturing, thinking early on to make something. You also sold it. Again, there was no middleman. Again, cottage industry is the idea of making things yourselves, again, without the process. And then you would just sell right to the people from there. Early public services that were available in, again, the first onset of settlement or the congregating of people, as they're making that go, is primarily just offering protection, again, they as much as they could. There wasn't normally like a police force or something like that, but, like, usually there was someone in charge and they would set up kind of protections, whether that was walls or if they had patrols. If it was something that became much more advanced or large scale, they might have put together like a little mini defender of soldiers who would fight and they would again defend the places that are there. Business services is really, again, early settlements just tried to create a space where everyone could trade goods with each other. Remembering everyone was making their own stuff, and this was pre currency in a lot of situations. So, this is much more about bartering. So, the business services to allow that to happen in a safe and fair way. Basically, officials in the settlement usually would provide producer services like regulating the terms of transactions or setting fair prices, keeping records, creating a currency system eventually. That would be something that would be provided to help business flourish, as we know the definition of business services is. So, those are like early, first come idea as far as settlements go. So let's get some practical examples, I suppose. So thinking ancient, our very beginnings of congregating of people in ancient urban settlements. So again, moving into this idea of cities or the development of cities, settlements that were first established in Eastern Mediterranean. Again, 2500 BC is when this was. So quite a long time ago. The very first that we have records of and that we know and we can understand well is Kenosis on the island of Crete. This is the first Greek, not Greek, civilization. There is the development of Troy, Mycenae, and also in Greece, so on and so forth. What ended up happening is in these particular places, the populations boomed and that allowed or forced the settlement to evolve and adapt. They become much larger scale, and through that development, they become not just a place to bury the dead and a place to again be able to come and get what you need and get out. They become these epicenters of trading and epicenters of power, organized into city states. City states is something that we talked about last semester when we were talking about political geography, the development of states, and again, that concept of state. And cities are what motivated that development in a lot of places. So we saw that these settlements became so large scale and so important to their populations that they become these independent self-governing communities that included the settlement and then of course the nearby countryside. Athens was another good example. It was the largest city state in Greece and it came to control pretty much the entire Greek empire as it started to grow even bigger. Rome is another example of a city which became a city state and then eventually grew to change the whole landscape of what does government look like, what do cities look like, how important are cities. Rome had a population in some instances and some records of about 1 million people, which is crazy huge. And it changed the whole process of settlement and sort of the idea here. The Roman Empire scaled from all the way up into the UK, down into Africa, all the way from India over to Spain. It's a huge space. And all of those people looked to Rome as a model of this huge city, but there were other settlements that started to grow up around them to become more important. After the fall of the Roman Empire, it really changed a lot of what was happening in settlements. And because Rome, the city, really lost a lot of its power, it was basically destroyed twice in the fall of Rome. The people lost that center, that central control, and that center of services. And what ends up happening during the medieval time period, this is going to be looking at the post Roman Empire, where everything breaks down into smaller pieces, is this dense network of small market towns. So reverting back to what those early settlements were more like. That would serve the needs of a particular lord. And each of those sort of market towns were central to a larger space that was controlled. The largest medieval European settlements served as new power centers for lords and church leaders, and again, so on and so forth, where the trading happened. When we look to medieval settlements, most of them are going to be focused around religion. Again, this is the rise of Christianity as basically the guiding force for all people for a really long time. So when you look to medieval urban settlements, the largest structure is almost always going to be a church. There's almost always a wall for protection because they don't have the big government in charge to be able to provide a lot of those things that they got used to under the Roman control. Those medieval urban settlements, in a lot of instances, are under the control of a particular lord, which eventually becomes king. And then the more traditional, again, European monarchies start to develop. And then, of course, we know our nation and nation states come out of that development. This is just looking at another space where there were medieval again, urban space that, again, we're going to develop. Jericho, Memphis, Thebes, all of them important. So in a handful of these, you've noticed the word urban or urbanized. These are things that, of course, are really important to understand. Again, this is not bolded, but this is all important, okay? So settlements pre-industrial revolution, they all were pretty limited in size, remembering that most people didn't need to live in the cities. They lived on their farms or they lived in their smaller settlements, and they got what they needed. And they only came into these larger towns or these larger settlements when they really needed something specialized, some kind of service that they couldn't get elsewhere, some kind of idea that they couldn't get elsewhere. After the Industrial Revolution and the changing of economies, where people stopped working on the farms and started looking for manufacturing jobs, we saw that the population in urban settlements started to grow and to grow really, really fast. And that's what urbanization is the rapid growth of cities. What we're going to see here is that there is again, an increase in the number of people living in urban settlements. So, in living in a rural space versus an urban space. So, in developing countries, there 8 of 10 people, sorry, I apologize, countries have 8 of the 10 most populous cities in the world, where we see this shift to basically manufacturing. People are going to go where the jobs are, and jobs almost always, as we know, are going to be where the people are. So we're going to see factories are going to develop. People are going to be attracted to the factories, and then it keeps attracting more and more people, more and more factories, more and more ideas, again, that are going to be part of that process. And then there's simply an increase in the percentage of people living in urban settlements. So as the percentage of people living in urban settlements has increased, we're seeing this process that in 1800, only about 3% of the entire population the world is going to live in cities, identify themselves as living in an urban space. By 1850, it jumps 3%, and then by 1900, it jumps to 14, and then we're going to see it just doubles and pretty much doubles again. By 2000, 50% of the world is going to identify as living in a city or in an urban population. In developed countries, 3/4 of the population is going to be urbanized. In developing, about 2/5 is urbanized, because knowing that agriculture is much more prevalent in developed countries still is important. Uh, as far as differences, the last sort of thing that they talk about in this key issue is differences between urban and rural settlements. Pretty straightforward, I would assume. The size, again, the density of people living, how close together they are. And the last one is social heterogeneity. Of course, we're looking at this idea that, again, in our urban space, there's a lot more diversity of people, just full stop, than there is in rural settlements. And I'm not saying that there is no diversity in rural settlements, it's just less likely in the long run. So this is just looking at kind of distribution of percent urban. Again, the developed world is going to be much more likely to find people living in our urban spaces, which of course is the concentration of service jobs, and that's where most people work anyways. So it makes a lot of sense, I would hope, by looking at this distribution map. This is just looking at a distribution of different cities around the world, and then the amount of population that they have, as you can see from that overall key. Um, Best thing to do, and again, I'm not going to stop to let you do this. Well, you have to stop me in this particular item if you're going to give it a shot. So we did this for the first two key issues. Here's for the second two key issues. In the remaining boxes on your little piece of paper. Again, you can stop me right now because it's going to pop up all the answers in a second. But the first key issue is where our business service is distributed. Again, stop me now so you can do this one. Then again, here is the response. Again, we are going to see that business services cluster in global cities, remembering our alpha, beta, gamma. Again, developing countries provide a lot of interesting opportunities for business services and offshore financials, and of course, business outsourcing. Communities specialize in the provision of particular services, and that specialized service constitutes the community's economic base. There's a really good list in there that you guys should take a look at of examples of different economic base. Again, it's in the last part of that chapter. Other key issue, why do services cluster in settlements? Pause me now. Okay, and then we're looking at settlements that exist at this moment. We can classify them as really rural and urban. Rural are usually going to be specializing in agriculture services, and they're either clustered or dispersed. And then when we're seeing this, that is how settlements were, again, for the most part, and not very many people lived in what we consider urban settlements until after the Industrial Revolution started to happen. In the developed countries, there's a higher percentage of urban residents. In developing, again, they contain most of the really big cities, but still people don't live there overall. They're going to be working outside of and coming to the cities for the services that they need overall. Okay, that's it. That is all of chapter 12 that we've got going on here. So the last thing to talk about briefly is work to be completed. So work to be completed by the end of the day today. You've got your 2 progress checks on AP Classroom. Again, just like last time, I'm checking for completion, not giving you a score based on the end result there. Again, something that is different this week, as I gave you guys a heads up last week, is that we are going to be having a little quiz, a check, is kind of how I'm going to look at it. It's going to be 15 multiple choice questions. It's going to be online. And you have to do it sometime tomorrow during the school day. So you should need to make some time, block out a time in your schedule today, making sure that you've got that going on. So it's going to be a Google form link. You'll see it pretty straightforward once you get going. You'll have technically all day to complete it. It'll be open the whole day. It shouldn't take you all day. It's 15 multiple choice questions. Feel free to have your notes in your textbook there and available to help you try and get this completed. It's only open throughout tomorrow's school day. No submissions will be accepted after 3 p.m. And if you miss out on this opportunity, you need to reach out to me directly, and we will talk about a possible option for making up this item overall. You've got some more reading. We're just moving on to the next. Ooh, those pages are wrong. I will fix them on Classroom. Please ignore those pages for now. Again, they'll be different once this gets posted. I will be holding a meet tomorrow early in the morning. If anyone is looking for some extra guidance on the information talked about today, or if you just have questions in general, I'll be on Google Meet from 9 to about 9:30 or so. Feel free to drop in if you have any questions. I hope you guys all have a good day.